Before we begin this morning's webinar, wherever you are joining us from around Australia, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we're all meeting today. On behalf of the University of Queensland, I pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. Well, as most of you I'm sure know, the Great Barrier Reef is one of the great wonders of the natural world. It's a treasure of biodiversity and the lifeblood of the North Queensland tourism industry. The reef is about the size of Italy, so big it's visible from space, the largest living structure on the planet. It supports an astonishing variety of life. It's home to 10% of all the world's corals, and they're found on some 3,000 separate reefs spread across the marine park. When the World Heritage Committee listed the Great Barrier Reef on its register in 1981, Australia undertook to safeguard its World Heritage values. But today the reef is under severe stress, and one of its greatest stressor is climate change, caused in large part by the burning of fossil fuels. What can Australia do to manage and protect the reef better, especially under the impacts of climate change? My name is Marian Wilkinson, and I've covered many stories on the reef, climate change and the environment for the ABC Four Corners program and for the Sydney Morning Herald. This morning, our guests are two leading University of Queensland experts who will talk about the cumulative impact of the last 3 mass bleachings on the reef and where we go from here. Dr. Selina Ward is a senior lecturer in the School of Biological Sciences. A well-known coral biologist, she specialises in coral reproduction and recruitment. She's also very popular because she's the academic director of the beautiful Heron Island Research Station on the Great Barrier Reef. She was past president of the Australian Coral Reef Society, a director of the International River Foundation and the Australian Marine Conservation Society. Dr. Pedro Fidelman is a senior research fellow at UQ's Centre for Policy Futures and has extensive experience in marine and coastal governance. He's contributed to several national and international initiatives in this area and is a member of the Future Earth Australian Oceans and Coasts National Strategy Expert Working Group. And significantly for us today, he was a lead author on oceans and coastal policy in the latest UN Global Environment Outlook report. Pedro's current research focuses on governance, policy and regulatory innovation around global environmental change. And this, of course, is very important for Australia when we talk about the future of the Great Barrier Reef. First, I'd like to ask our two guests to give us a 5-minute rundown on what the latest bleachings on the reef is telling them. I will then have a conversation with Selina and Pedro, and after that chat, we'd love to get some questions from you. But first, Selina, over to you for your thoughts on this 3rd mass bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef in 5 years.
Thanks, Marian. So, yes, I'm going to give a background on the bleaching events on the Great Barrier Reef, so this will lead into our questions. So, I'm hoping that there are lots of non-scientists amongst the audience. So, I'd like to start by just giving you the really basic background so that it makes sense. So, corals are animals. They're colonial animals, so made up of hundreds, sometimes thousands of tiny animals. And each of these is a bit like an upside down jellyfish. And these have microscopic algae, millions of them living inside the cells, and they give the coral energy. So when we have a bleaching event, these microalgae are lost predominantly. Lots and lots of them leave the corals, and the corals lose their colour and go pale, hence the term bleaching. But bleached corals don't necessarily die. So they're the important points you need to note. So we have had 5 bleaching events on the Great Barrier Reef, 5 major ones 1998. Just going to share this screen with you now. So I've just got a few maps here to help you visualise what I'm explaining. So if we start by looking at 1998 was the first big bleaching on the Great Barrier Reef. This predominantly affected inshore reefs along the reef, and it didn't affect much of the north at all. In 2002, again, lots of inshore reefs, hardly anything in the north, but some of the offshore reefs in the central and south affected well. These two bleaching events only had about 5% damage. And then we came to 2016, 17. Right? Okay, 2016 and 17. And these events dwarfed the prior bleaching. So in 2016, the event predominantly in the north of the Great Barrier Reef, with 93% of reefs being affected. In 2016-17, so back-to-back bleaching events, not as severe an event, and centred mostly around the central regions of the Great Barrier Reef. Now, what we had in these two events is a very tight correlation between the amount of heat received by the waters of the Great Barrier Reef and the severity of the bleachings at those times. And you can see that in these two maps. Very good matching there. And then to this year, so 2020, in February, we had the highest seawater temperature anomaly, so the warmest water, that we've recorded since 1900. So that's quite extraordinary. Now, when in the summer, we can measure the temperature of the water and how long the heat has been there to develop alert levels of bleaching. So alert level 2 is the highest that we have. And by March of this year, we had a lot of the Great Barrier Reef under alert level 2 or alert level 1, which means that there was a lot of hot water that had been sitting there for a long time. And so we expected another bleaching event at this time. So if we compare these three bleaching events, the bleaching event for this year is quite different. It's really spread out, so it has the greatest geographic extent of any of these bleaching events, going right from the Torres Strait all the way down to the bottom of the Great Barrier Reef. So this time, the south didn't escape the bleaching events. So that's unfortunate for the south. But not all of the reefs were affected, with about 40% of the reefs that weren't affected by this event. What we see is that in the north of the Great Barrier Reef, those outer reefs were not affected much by this bleaching event. And the reason for this is probably that these reefs were affected so badly in 2007 that the susceptible corals haven't been replaced there yet. So the corals remaining are the more hardy species. But what we find now after all of these bleaching events is that there are very few areas that have not been affected by one of the bleaching events. We've got this area up in the north, the outer reefs of the north up near Torres Strait, and some of the areas in the south particularly noticeable as having not bleached. And this is an important point in terms of the way we consider conservation and protection of parts of the reef. But I'll leave it there now to lead into questions later.
Thanks very much, Selina. Pedro, if we could come to you, I think that we're just going to see these panels of Selina's come down in a minute. Mm-hmm. And Pedro, yeah, you have come to join us there. I'd like to get your rundown on what your take is on this third mass bleaching in the last 5 years, from a policy perspective particularly.
Thanks, Marian. And yeah, I'm going to take a slightly different take to Selina's presentation. The main thing for me, the third bleaching event on the Great Barrier Reef in 5 years provide us with a sobering message. The message that the predictions the science community has been making over the last few decades on the threat of climate change to coral reefs are being realized, and more concerning, at a faster pace than some initially thought. While we are yet to fully understand the effects of the latest bleaching event, it warns us that how vulnerable Australia's Great Barrier Reef is to the impacts of a warming climate. So I would like to move beyond the limits of the reef for a moment and look at the broader context in which coral bleaching takes place, so that we can better understand why mass bleaching is happening so frequently and what options we have to address this problem. So to understand the root causes of coral bleaching, we need to go back in time to the 18th century England, where the Industrial Revolution kick-started climate change. So at that time, they never thought that their activities would be contributing to climate change, and consequently to coral bleaching 2+ centuries down the track in a distant land called Australia that they came to settle on. So since the Industrial Revolution, with the use of fossil fuels such as coal, oil, gas to power our economies, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has increased. As a result, global temperatures have also increased. Such increase in the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere and increasing global warming are unprecedented in human history. And corals can be very sensitive to warmer temperatures, which explains the bleaching events we have recently observed in the Great Barrier Reef. So coral bleaching comes down to increased concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which the solution lies on efforts to reduce our global carbon emissions. And addressing the carbon emission issue has been in the international political agenda for at least 3 decades now. The Rio Earth Summit in 1992 established the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and Australia was actually one of the first nations to ratify the Framework Convention. In 1997, the Kyoto Protocol committed developed countries such as Australia to targets to reduce carbon emissions. Then Australia was not so keen to join the Kyoto Protocol. It only ratified the Kyoto 10 years later in 2007, following changing in the federal government. The Kyoto Protocol was then followed by the Paris Agreement, which Australia signed in 2016, agreeing to work with other nations to limit the rise of global average temperature to no more than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So under the Paris Agreement, Australia and other signatory nations also committed to work to limit the global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, given that this target would significantly reduce the risks and impacts of climate change. Our pledge under the Paris Agreement is to reduce Australia's emission by between 26 and 28% of the emissions created in 2005 to be achieved by the year 2030. But policy responses aiming to reduce carbon emissions are not limited to the national level only. States and local governments are also committing to emissions reduction targets. Queensland, for example, has set the goal to achieve zero net emissions by 2050, which is part of the current Queensland climate transition strategy. Also, efforts to reduce emissions are not limited to government only. Many businesses, non-government organizations, community and individuals are involved in a range of initiatives aiming to reduce carbon emissions. So summarizing, what I'm trying to say here is that addressing the root causes of coral bleaching is a rather complex undertaking. The future of the reef will depend on actions at different levels, from individual to the global community level. And I'll leave it there for the moment.
Thanks very much, Pedro. And I think both of our experts here have given us some big picture details to deal with here. Selina on what we've seen on the scale of the bleachings on the Barrier Reef, and Pedro on the scale of the policy task. Selina, I'd like to start with you with some of the questions where we can go down a bit deeper on this issue. On a very practical level, when will the coral scientists, with COVID-19 going on and all the other problems, when will they be able to do the in-water surveys that will be able to show us how lethal this latest bleaching has been, and whether the areas that we think will escape significant coral mortality will escape, and which ones have been hit hardest?
Okay, so we're probably not going to have a good idea about the mortality from this event until November. So the thing is that post-bleaching mortality unfolds over a fairly long period. So far, we can go and look at corals, but we can only look at recovery of individual corals to this point. So there's been some nice work done with Reef Ecologics so far at a number of sites around Cairns, Townsville and the Whitsundays, where they've found quite promising recovery of corals there and low mortality. But the process, first of all, the corals may get their algae back and start to get their colour back. But then those corals can still be susceptible to other things like coral disease and competition. So maybe algae growing over the top of them or soft corals, that sort of thing. So we need that longer time frame. We also need the scientists to be able to get out of the water, and that's been a little limited. Our research stations are mostly closed at the moment, so there are limitations as well. But it's important to note that there are essentially two levels of recovery. So we can talk about an individual coral recovering. So we could go and look at in November and it's going to be alive and well. But then we talk about reef recovery, and these are quite different. So whilst corals might recover from this bleaching event, the recovery of a reef is a much longer process. So for reefs that bleached, say in 2016, the recovery of that reef is all about replacing the corals that have been lost and getting back to how it was. So it's important not to confuse those two things. So we may find that recovery in the south, we might be talking about those susceptible to bleaching corals that go first, getting their colour back and being okay. And we're really hoping that recovery on that level might be high, because we did have, although we had that very hot weather, we also had some low pressure systems in March that brought clouds and rain and wind, which cuts the light, which can stop bleaching in its tracks a bit. So we're hoping that recovery on that level might be quite good.
Well, obviously, you're talking about this in the context too of the last two significant bleachings. From your point of view, what sections of the reef do you think will find it hardest to recover on the back of those 2016 and 17 bleachings as well?
Well, certainly those outer reefs in the north that had such high mortality are not showing bleaching this time, but mostly probably because those branching species that were lost so quickly haven't had a chance to get back there yet. So what it means is we've got a different community structure. We've got the more hardy corals there now. So getting back to that community structure initially means that we need a gap between our bleaching events to be able to get that level of recovery. It'll be interesting to see how the south goes, because there hasn't been a bleaching there for some time. So that means that we may lose a whole lot of those very susceptible corals. So that could, we've just got to wait and see, though. It is hard to know at this stage. I mean, on an obvious level, we are likely to have mortality, some mortality anywhere we've had bleaching events. But there are other things that are important in terms of how quickly those reefs recover. It's important that those reefs are able to get larvae from other places so that new corals can start up from there. So how isolated those reefs are is important too.
I wanted to ask you about some research that was in the recent UN Global Outlook report. And they referred to a study, I'm sure you're well aware of it, in 2009 that suggested that tropical coral reefs had passed their tipping point some years ago, and that climate change leading to rising seawater temperatures would inevitably mean more frequent bleaching. Do you agree that coral reefs have passed their tipping point? And if so, what do you think happens from here? Inevitably, the bleaching's going to get more frequent.
Yeah, so it's hard to determine where that tipping point is and whether it's the same for reefs everywhere. Certainly, we will have more frequent bleaching events. We're finding that already. So every reef, you can determine a threshold temperature above which that reef is likely to bleach. And so as the temperature increases through the century, we're going to be going over those threshold temperatures more and more often. And that's what we're seeing. And the predictions of that happening have been with us since late last century. But what we do find now is that in the past, it used to be those El Nino years where we would have the bleaching events. Not because El Nino causes bleaching per se, but because that's where we had the highest temperatures. But now the temperatures have risen so much that non-El Nino years, such as this year and 2017, are still warmer than El Nino years in the past. So because of that, unless we can really dramatically drop our emissions straight away, we're going to get more frequent bleachings into the future. So we still have plenty of coral left though. So I personally haven't lost hope. I think we can save them, but we're going to have to act dramatically soon.
Well, Pedro, when we think about the reef, most of us think about the incredible biodiversity and the beauty of it, but you also have to look at it from an economic point of view. How important economically is the Great Barrier Reef to the Queensland tourism industry, especially the North Queensland tourism industry?
Yeah, this is an important question. It's an important issue. The economic contribution of the reef to the national economy through reef-dependent industry, reef-based industry, such as tourism and fishing, was estimated at $6.4 billion per year, supporting over 6,000 jobs in the region. So that's really something. And our research from 2016 tells us that frequent coral bleaching could lead to a drop in visitors to the region, both domestic and international visitors, by more than 1 million tourists per year, and consequently a loss of tourism revenue in the order of $1 billion, as well as the loss of some 10,000 jobs. So the importance of the reef for the tourism industry cannot be overestimated.
Well, as you would well know, Pedro, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority has told us in report after report that climate change remains the greatest challenge to the reef. Given what is at stake, why do you think the reef isn't given more priority when Australia's emissions policy is being discussed at the national level?
Yeah, I agree that the reef should be one of the key priorities driving Australia's emissions reduction policy. But the reality is that Australia is yet to develop a comprehensive and coherent policy to reduce emissions to levels necessary to minimize environmental, social, and economic costs associated with the impacts of a warming climate. We are still one of the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases per capita. On the other hand, Australia is so rich in renewable energy resources, and we have the human and technological capacity to make use of these resources to transition to a prosperous low carbon economy. So in these regards, it's critical to develop innovative policies in this space. For example, investing in renewables for economic recovery post-COVID-19 would create close to 3 times as many jobs as a fossil fuel-led recovery. So these kind of policies are also critical if Australia is to be able to influence global action on mitigation for the benefit of the reef. So if we are going to save the reef, we'll need to lead by example.
So that's the next thing I was going to ask you. Given we know there is a time lag between greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere and feeling the impacts in places like the reef of climate change, do you think at this point, looking at the policy settings we have on emissions, will it be possible to sustainably manage the Great Barrier Reef in the medium to long term?
In the Great Barrier Reef, there is a strong focus on the notion of reef resilience-based management or management aiming to improve the resilience of the reef. So the rationale for this approach is that addressing local and regional impacts has the potential to increase the ecological resilience of the reef, and such resilience would help the reef recover from disturbances, including bleaching. Another approach, which is an emerging approach, is restoration and adaptation interventions, which aim also to increase the resilience, the resilience of the reef, increase the resistance to heat stress through, for example, hybridization. But however, as you mentioned, without significant reduction in emissions, resilience-based management and restoration and adaptation projects alone are unlikely to help address the impacts of climate change on coral reefs. So these may help buy reefs time while we transition towards a low carbon society. But we have to note also that in the case of restoration and adaptation interventions, the kind of technology needed for deployment at scale is yet to be developed.
Well, here I want to go back to Selina, because her particular expertise is also in coral recruitment and how coral reefs recover. Selina, on a very basic level, what are the key factors for people out there that means a coral reef has a good chance, and its corals have a good chance of recovering and recruiting new corals?
So on the coral level, for a coral to recover and not die, it's about how hot it gets and how long it lasts. So the longer you have the hot water, the less chance you have of surviving. But for reefs, it's about how much mortality there has been. So how many corals do we need replaced in the system? But it's also about successful recruitment. So by recruitment, I mean bringing in new corals, so as new larvae that settle and survive to grow up to then become new corals. And the success of recruitment is determined, for a start, by how many adult healthy corals are left that are going to reproduce. Now, unfortunately, after bleaching events, my own work has shown that there's often a delay in full reproduction occurring after a bleaching event. So sometimes recruitment is delayed for that reason. Certainly after the 2016-17 bleaching events, there was a 90% drop in recruitment initially.
Wow, that's a lot.
So, and also the location of the reef is important. So you need to be able to have a supply of larvae coming. So we call this connectivity. So this means that you're going to have, for a start, healthy corals upstream somewhere that can provide those larvae, and for the currents to come in the direction of your reef so that you're going to have those larvae coming. And then when the larvae do arrive, you want to not have a reef that's covered in algae, because then it's hard for the larvae to settle, or a reef that's covered in sediment. So these sorts of things are important as well.
Well, you heard Pedro before mentioning what I guess in another way is called bioengineering for corals to try and preserve coral reefs. And that's quite a big idea at the moment. There's a lot of research going into it. In your view, how useful is this bioengineering work, and what sort of time frame do you think our researchers have to work on this?
So there's a lot of really fascinating and great work being done in this area. This year there's been some lovely work published where strains of the microalgae that are more resistant to heat have been developed, and they've been placed into new corals, and those corals have been found to resist bleaching better. So that's a really good breakthrough. But the people doing this work, though, understand that without climate change being fixed, this work alone is not going to be able to save the reef, because as Pedro suggested, it needs to be scaled up. So fabulous work, and I really think we have to do it. But like a lot of the really good restoration techniques that are being developed, the reef is enormous, so we've got to be able to scale them up. But very helpful on a smaller scale, and the work continues. I mean, unfortunately, you can't just go out there and spray microalgae on the reef, because the adult colonies won't take them up. So, you know, it's got to be done coral by coral. But there are other things as well. There's cloud brightening that's being looked at for the Great Barrier Reef. So this essentially means that we use sea spray to increase aerosols and brighten the clouds so that they reflect heat away. That's a technique that's being carefully considered at the moment. I think, though, I'm very enthused about these pieces of work. I think we do have to be careful not to fund crazy ideas that may bring harm. And there's certainly been some of those that have been suggested.
Well, and I think, yes, that gets back to what is actually, given there is a limited amount of dollars to go into research work on how to preserve and strengthen the reef, what do you do? And I wanted to ask you, in the light of this, Australia has done a lot of work over the years on resilience-based management of the Great Barrier Reef, and Pedro talked about this. Do you think we're seeing the limits of resilience-based management of the reef in view of the enormous impact that climate change is having?
Well, I don't think we ever thought that looking after resilience would save us completely from climate change. I think it's more about buying time, and essentially by being able to stop the loss of corals for reasons other than climate change. So I still think we have no excuse not to continue to pursue things that will increase resilience.
Like water quality and things like that.
For me, water quality is utmost importance, because we don't want to be losing corals because there's too much.
Oh, Selina, we've just lost you.
Sorry.
Yep, you're back. Yes.
Enthusiastic with my hands. I don't want to be losing corals because there's too many poisons in the water, or there's too much sediment covering new recruits or adults. So taking care of water quality, trying to stop the industrialisation of that Great Barrier Reef coastline, which will bring further reductions in water quality. Look, protecting areas, looking after our fish, doing the good regulation that we already do. there's still going to be advantage to doing that into the future. Even if we haven't got a handle on climate change, it's still saving every coral we can at the moment, I think, is of utmost importance.
Right. So, Pedro, I want to come back to you at this point. Now, in the last UN Global Environment Outlook report, which I read recently, which of course you're a lead author on one of the sections on oceans and coastal areas in that, but it gave a very pessimistic take on countries dependent, nations dependent on reef-based fisheries or reef-based tourism. And they suggested that those nations would need to develop policies for the transition to post-reef economies within the next decade. It was one of your colleagues actually from UQ that worked on that section of the report. Do you think that's too pessimistic, or do you think that report is being realistic?
I have to say, when I took part in writing the report, and when I saw one of my colleagues suggest that sentence, I was a bit shocked. But then when you think that coral bleaching, if coral bleaching is to be as frequent as we have seen over the past 5 years, the implications of for reef-dependent industries such as tourism seems to be obvious. But also think that the sentence is it's got a more general take. Like if you look at the dispersion of tropical coral reefs, most of them, they are located in developing nations where the state of the reef is not as good as the Great Barrier Reef, where they're being continually threatened by pollution, overfishing, destructive fishing practices. And in those areas, you have a very dependent population on the reef. And on the top of that, levels of poverty are very low. So it's it adds to a dramatic situation in those places. But in regards to the Great Barrier Reef, back in 2011, my colleagues and I, we developed future scenarios around the impacts of climate change on reef-dependent industries and the ability to respond to and adapt to those impacts, and exploring the different scenarios with representatives from the tourism and fishing industry, pointed to the need for policies that are supportive. Oh, that's a difficult one. Supportive of these industries in the face of disruptors like climate change. Even though the sentence sounds really dramatic, we need to prepare for a post-reef economy. I think even within the Great Barrier Reef, which has got corals in much better condition relative to other parts of the world, we need to start a conversation with reef-dependent industries around current and anticipated challenges associated with coral bleaching, and adequate and appropriate policy response to those challenges. So I think this is a timely issue that we need to start exploring.
Well, I might précis a couple of questions here at the end for you, Pedro, because we've got a lot of questions coming in the Q&A, and I know people want us to get there. But briefly, what do you think are the most pressing issues for Australia's reef managers at the moment? And I'm thinking of everyone from the Marine Park Authority to the tourism and state government managers, as well as federally. And in the context of that, how do you persuade the public in Australia and a lot of climate activists that the reef isn't doomed, because there is a lot of doomism out there at the moment because of how people feel about the lack of action and the speed with which change has been coming to the reef, especially as manifested in these last 3 bleachings.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, the management of the reef has a strong focus on minimizing the impacts of local and regional threats, such as water quality, with the aims to increase the resilience of the reef. I believe that we'll see that focus continue into the future, and as Selina mentioned, it's of ultimate importance that we continue doing the best we can to manage the reef. Also, as I mentioned before, restoration and adaptation are emerging approaches. In this regard, I believe the reef managers will focus on developing specific policies and regulation to ensure that these approaches don't pose unnecessary risks and impacts on the reef while maximizing potential conservation benefits. And another pressing issue should be working with reef-dependent industries, communities, and traditional owners to devise strategies to help them to adapt, considering the effects of coral bleaching on their activities within the marine park. With regards to the negative message around the reef, we need to be. I actually think that we need to be careful about news of the impacts of bleaching on the reef, which may create an idea, as you mentioned, Marian, that there is not much we can do to help the reef, and this is not true. We need to continue to manage the reef as best as we can, while also focusing on reducing carbon emissions. As I mentioned earlier, there's a tremendous opportunity for Australia to transition to a low carbon economy. We can see positive action taking place at state and local government levels where support for more ambitious emissions targets is relatively stronger. And also many sectors of society and business are shifting towards more sustainable practice. The booming uptake of rooftop solar and the development of large-scale renewable projects in Australia illustrate this shift. So I remain positive, though with the window for action closing quickly, we need more ambitious and innovative policies also very quickly.
Right. Well, look, there are a lot of questions coming in for the panel at the moment. And so I'm going to try and pick some. There are some very particular questions and there's some big picture questions. But perhaps, Selina, if I start with you, one of the specific questions that has come up is what type of corals appear to, are there specific coral species that are showing signs of adaptation to the warming waters?
Well, that's a tricky question. Given the large mortality of recent bleaching events, it's not obvious. Certainly there are corals that don't bleach as easily, and so these are the ones that are the remaining corals. But it's hard to see a lot of evidence in the field of adaptation yet.
Right.
I answer that question differently, but
it's early days, in other words. Yeah.
Well, Selina, just following up on that question, there are studies that the northern part of the reef, they have corals that are more resistant to heat stress.
Yes.
So do you see that those corals are, ones that, would have more chance to adapt to the impacts of heat stress?
I Some of it's a wait and see, isn't it? That they might be doing okay now, but will they do okay as the temperature continues to rise? And depending on how fast it rises, it's the speed of change that's the main problem.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, I think. Yeah, do you get the time to recover? In the same vein, someone rightly asked, which I think is a critical question because it also impacts on the climate change front as well, is what about the impact of cyclonic activity on the corals, given that we expect not necessarily the number of cyclones, but the intensity of cyclones to increase. But I'll put that to both of you, but perhaps Selina, you'd like to start.
So there was a piece of work that was published in 2012 that looked at loss of coral cover in the 27 years before then, and they certainly had around half of that damage that they modelled as being due to cyclone damage. But that was, so there's definitely been a lot of cyclone damage, and of course reefs are used to having cyclones, but they're not used to having such intense cyclones and other stresses that come along at the same time. So yes, a big concern, but in terms of working out the percentages of mortality due to each of the different stresses at the moment, I don't think we're quite up to date with being able to be sure of those figures since 2016, because of course it depends when the cyclones fall and when the bleaching events fall. Both very concerning in terms of recovery though.
Yeah, and Pedro, I guess you might be slightly more au fait with what's happening in developing countries with this increase in intensity of cyclones and the impact on reefs, especially from an economic point of view. Did you get much insight of that, for example, when you were doing the global economic outlook, environmental outlook report as well?
Yeah, the take is that climate change is it's a compounding stressor on the top of everything else that is happening on those reefs, and that can create negative synergies with, for example, water pollution and other local and regional stressors. So yeah, it's a double. It's like a double effect, because you have the increase in the frequency and intensity of cyclones, and on the top of that you have bleaching due to the warm waters. So you have a double effect. You have a synergistic effect caused both by climate change directly or indirectly.
Selina, oh yeah, sorry, Selina, you wanted to add something to that?
Just a small thing, and on top of that too, then you have water quality implications. I mean, if we think about Cyclone Debbie, there was a lot of sediment that was stirred up as well, that was dumped on top of corals, which is a big problem. And then you have things like the Abbott Point coal terminal, where we had coal that went into the wetlands and into the sea. So it's,
and I think it's as I mentioned earlier, it's from a policy perspective a very complex issue. You're dealing with a range of policy sectors that need to be coordinated and working together for the benefit of the reef.
Yeah. Selina, I wanted to come back to you. Someone's put up a pretty important but basic question they want to get a handle on. When we talk about a bleaching of a reef, what percentage of a reef needs to be bleached for it to be defined as bleached when you're doing your surveys?
I saw that, and I'm thinking that I don't think there's a particular number that we use, because we tend to talk about a mild bleaching event or a serious bleaching event based on the percentage of reefs in an area, or the percentage of corals on a reef that are bleached. So so I don't know that there's a set number. We just talk about the degree of bleaching.
Right. So maybe I think as you say, there's a definition of moderate, I think mild, and then severe. So maybe you could give the attendee a bit of an idea of what those three definitions are.
Yeah, so perhaps if you had 15% of the corals on your reef bleached, that would be a mild bleaching event. If you had 60 or 50%, that would be moderate, say, and if you had 80%, that would be severe. Something like that.
Okay, going back to the big picture, Pedro, this might be one for you. Is one of our audience have asked, is the Great Barrier Reef's World Heritage listing under threat, I guess, in the light of these three mass bleachings?
Well, I would say yes, as all the World Heritage corals around the world they're all being affected by coral bleaching, and consequently these have implications for World Heritage values. But that's something that that's a very interesting question that leads to a more broader perspective, is that on the definition of the World Heritage values, I suspect that these will need to be reviewed in the future in light of climate change, because otherwise we'll be it becomes moving posts, basically, because the reefs are constantly now, as a result of global environmental change, the reefs are changing fast and dramatically. So the initial World Heritage values that were envisaged or created years ago no longer corresponds to the reality that we live in.
Well, I guess that goes into one of our next questions from the audience, which is, what's your best case scenario for what can be preserved of the reef? And I guess I'll pitch that question to both of you. Pedro, do you want to start on that?
Oh, that's a good one. I'm unable to say, specific areas and specific reefs, but there is a project which the University of Queensland is involved that aimed to identify the 50 best reefs that would, the best 50 reefs that would have more chance to be looked after, to invest in conservation efforts, and to protect them, that would have more chance to withstand climate change. So identifying these 50 top reefs took into account not only biophysical and ecological attributes, but also the governance regimes in which these reefs are located, the social-economic pressure on the reefs, which is a good point. Some of the reefs are, in some part of the world, the reefs are degraded to a certain extent that they may not offer the best conservation values in light of what's happening in terms of climate change and local and regional threats.
Selina, what's your best case scenario about what can be preserved?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question. I know there's some great work done also at UQ looking at the history of the reefs in terms of which ones had escaped bleaching during the time, which ones had the best connectivity with respect to larval transport and all of those things, which gave a grouping of reefs to pay the best protection attention to. But with this new bleaching now, there are fewer and fewer reefs which haven't bleached, so it's getting harder to prioritise in that sense. So I don't know, I think it's a really hard question.
Yeah.
try and protect and keep whatever we can by reducing emissions and improving water quality. So we've got the best for all of them, I think.
Well, I think to wrap up, I'd like to ask both of you. You've both worked on the reef and coral reefs for many years. What's your own view about your level of optimism about what can be done? And I'd also like to ask you, because I know you've been involved in a lot of international efforts as well as local efforts, how frustrated do you get working on the reef in communicating to others the urgency of the issues you're dealing with? Selina, I'll start with you on that one.
Yes, to start with the frustration, it's very real. And I think, I know earlier in my career, you know, you'd present the science and you'd make recommendations and action would happen. And then with climate change, it was all different. I mean, I worked with Ove Gulberg in his lab when that paper in 1999 came out predicting exactly what we're seeing now. And I think we all thought that, well, this was showing them, you know, the governments will take action now, and it's just not happening. And what I see, although the public is certainly so much better informed, so that's been really satisfying, the fact that there is so much more community support out there. So please keep that coming. But I think particularly now we have such an opportunity in this rebuilding stage for economic redevelopment with renewables, and for the government to decide to go down the route of new fossil fuel developments is really heartbreaking. And I think we really have to make our voices, everyone's voices, as loud as we possibly can now to try and get this to change direction. But I'm not losing hope. I'm hoping that we can make these governments see sense and change the direction.
Pedro, what do you think is your deepest frustration about this issue that you've been involved in? And do you think that the impact of Australians seeing these things like these mass bleachings, 3 in the last 5 years, is going to change the attitudes?
I have to say that I share Selina's optimism. I remain optimistic that we can get through this. In terms of communication, I think it's from a policy perspective, but the greatest frustration is when we get stuck in the science. And we fail to move beyond that, and the argument of, you know, if the science is the science settled or not settled. So it's really frustrating because we focusing on the wrong thing, and I explain, like, science is very important and have played a very important role in establishing you know, our understanding of why it's happening and how we can address the climate change issues through you know, technology, for example, or for other means. But we fail to understand that some people will not respond even if they see the reef bleaching. Even if we talk about the dire consequences of climate change, because it's not because of the science, it's because people have different motivations, and we need to learn how to identify these motivations and work with them in those terms. For example, you don't need to believe in climate change or be an environmental oriented person to take climate action. Many people in Australia are adopting putting solar panels on the roofs, basically because it will save them thousands of dollars a year. If you look at one example that I like, I think I give this example every time I talk about the possibilities and how we should engage with people that are not keen on climate action is look at Texas in the United States, a very conservative state, and it's one of the top states in terms of uptake of renewable energy, not because they are worried about climate change or they worry about the environment, but because they believe that's an economic option, profitable. And if you talk to them, they, I don't care about climate change, I don't care about the environment, but renewable, it's a great business and it's working for us. So we need to understand why people are trying to block climate action or the climate debate, because there are different motivations behind it, and only by understanding those motivations that we'll be able to move forward.
Okay, well, on that optimistic and pragmatic note, I do want to thank our two panellists, Dr. Selina Ward, Dr. Pedro Fidelman, who've been our guests today, very informative guests. There's a fantastic backup panel who've been helping us, Emily Cedars, Erin White, Rosalind Bolton, and of course the terrific Weston Brunner that helped put this together. I'm Marian Wilkinson. If you want to know a bit more about how we got to our climate policy, I've got a new book coming out soon called The Carbon Club, which will explain a bit of this. So thank you again to our audience, terrific questions, and to our guests, and to everyone at UQ.
Thank you.
Thank you.